Hi, everybody. I already love the energy in this room. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is LaFlamme, and as board member, oh, thank you. As a board member for the Samara Center for Democracy, it is truly my honor to welcome you all here. And I know it was a little bit tricky getting here tonight with the construction and the bike lanes and the Taylor Swift fans. But you're here now, so just shake it off. Yay, there's some Swifties in the crowd. That is officially my last Taylor Swift joke. I didn't have a lot of time to work on material because, in fact, my friend and fellow board member, Zane Velci, was supposed to be at this podium tonight, but Zane is actually unwell and not able to join us tonight, so he is at home in Calgary. We are wishing him a very speedy recovery, and I'm going to do my best to try to keep the evening on track, starting with where we are. This spectacular Winter Garden Theatre in Takaranto territory, covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and traditionally stewarded by many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, I always get that one wrong, my apologies, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This place has been a meeting point for the exchange of ideas for thousands and thousands of years. And it is in the spirit of that exchange that we come together tonight for In Defense of Democracy 2024 to share ideas and experiences, to reflect on our relation to this land and to each other, as well as our role as treaty people wherever we live on Turtle Island, and that includes the United States of America. Now, you will be forgiven if you have a touch of whiplash watching the rapid-fire events, developments south of the border, but, and please listen, if this is in fact a red alert moment for democracy, it's not the time to give up and tune out and turn off the podcasts and turn off the radio and turn off the TV. It is now really the time to prioritize thoughtful discussions and reasoned debate to make sure that the decisions we make in this country are based on understanding rather than partisan rhetoric and superficial opinions. That truly is what tonight is all about, fostering meaningful dialogue to learn and to try to do better than our predecessors. We have in that spirit a stimulating conversation ahead with the always engaging Nahlah Ayed and Pulitzer Prize-winning podcaster Connie Walker. I will have more to say about them coming up, but definitely an early applause. First, though, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the generous sponsors and partners that have made tonight's event possible. The Donner Foundation, Stikeman Elliott, Toronto Foundation, Next Door, Massey College, Catalyst, and Toronto Metropolitan University. And an extra thanks to Ontario Heritage Trust, who operate this magnificent national historic site that we are all in tonight. I just absolutely love just walking in the building, getting into that crazy old ghosted elevator and seeing the botanical garden here in the theater. Also, a special thanks to CBC Radio's IDEAS. This event is being recorded for broadcast on a future episode of IDEAS, and as much as you may love the ringtone that you have chosen for your phone, and I'm just going to say By the Seaside has done me well over the last couple of years, but it may not play that well on radio, so please put your phones on silent. Lastly, and most importantly, I just want to say that some of the evening's subject matter will be challenging. Talking about residential schools, child abuse, missing and murdered women is always painful, but acknowledging these facts That is the truth part in the truth process of truth and reconciliation. Still, it is hard to hear, so tonight, please take care. I want to invite to the stage now an absolutely remarkable leader in the field of democratic engagement and civic participation, and just a fabulous person all around. The woman whose strategic vision is really driving Samara's mission through research and outreach across justice, academic, and nonprofit sectors. She has appeared as an expert witness before parliamentary committees and is a familiar voice on radio and TV across this country. She is also the host of the acclaimed podcast, Humans of the House. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of the Samara Center for Democracy, Sabreena Delhon.
Thanks, Lisa. Good evening and welcome, everyone. On behalf of our team at the Samara Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 4th annual In Defense of Democracy event. So, a quick question. I just want to know, how many of you have been to this event before? Okay, great. Welcome back. Another question. How many of you are here for the first time? Okay, amazing. All right, let's welcome our new friends. So our team was beyond thrilled when we confirmed Connie Walker and Nahlah Ayed for this year's program. It has been such a privilege to work with them, and we know that their conversation tonight is going to be a very powerful one. Supporting these kinds of conversations, being able to come together like this, that's what our mission at the Samara Center is all about. We want to secure a vibrant culture of civic engagement in Canada. You might think that's about getting more people to vote or run in elections, and that's part of it, but there's so much more to being an active citizen. Right now, the way we understand politics in Canada is largely shaped by polls. Polls that ask us if we're feeling more polarized, if we're feeling more disconnected and distrustful of those around us. I don't know about you, but if someone kept asking me over and over again if I was feeling more polarized and angry, eventually I would just say yes. Asking the same questions and telling the same stories shapes the way we feel about and understand our democracy. Polling data shouldn't be the only way we make sense of things. We have to be careful about the stories we tell about our democracy. When these stories are only about what's going wrong, we lose sight of what's working well, what we can change, and what's vital to protect. Since 2021, we have been monitoring the health of online political conversations through our Sambot project. We do this by measuring abusive content received by candidates in Canadian elections. This year, we published a report exploring abuse in Toronto's most recent mayoral by-election. We analyzed nearly 125,000 tweets received by 54 of the 102 candidates. One key discovery was that just 30 users on X produced 10% of the abuse. This shows us that it's a small number of people, or maybe even bots, that are exerting an outsized effect on our online political conversations. And they are shaping stories about our democracy because social media platforms have recommendation systems that promote divisive and incendiary content. This prompts Canadians to see themselves as more divided, to experience more negative associations towards those with different political views. It doesn't mean that we're truly more divided on the substantive issues, but there's a perception that we are, and that's a major concern. What is truly threatening our democracy is the dominant story that we are disengaged and disconnected, that as a public, we're just angry or apathetic. And that's a shame, because our country is filled with active citizens, and there's no shortage of powerful local stories to tell about how we are supporting, enriching, and protecting our communities. How we are, through many acts, large and small, contributing to our democracy every day. If you helped your neighbor get groceries during the pandemic, if you've supported something at your kid's school, if you volunteered in local cleanups, you're an active citizen. These are the stories that should be driving how we understand our democracy. In the words of Professor Hari Khan, a leading social movement scholar, when we focus on how we're connected, no matter what our histories or experiences might be, it makes all the difference in what we can accomplish together. Tonight, I'm thrilled to share that this is what's driving a very special project that we've been working on at the Samara Center. Early next year, we'll be launching a new podcast called Group Chat. In each episode, we'll feature some friends making sense of what's happening in our politics and how, together, we can create an ambitious blueprint for strengthening and invigorating our democracy. At the Samara Center, we are so proud to produce nonpartisan, evidence-based insights about how to move forward in this task. If this work matters to you, support it. Make a donation by scanning the QR code on your program or visit our website. On your way out, visit our merch table to pick up a Humans of the House tote bag, our award-winning podcast, or buy a copy of our best-selling book, Tragedy in the Commons, which marks its 10th anniversary this year. The holidays are coming. Buy both. There is such power in gathering like this, in being together. And there is power in stories too. And that's why we're here tonight with two acclaimed journalists, masters of storytelling, who can give us a more nuanced, journalistic, and personal approach to thinking through how we defend our democracy. This is why the Samara Center exists. And on behalf of our team, it's my pleasure to warmly welcome you this evening.
Thank you so much, Sabreena. We are in such good hands. And I just encourage everyone to go on the website, check out the research. It's fascinating to see what's happening in our own country, in our own community, how Canadians are reacting to politicians, and the things that are being said on Parliament Hill really do matter here. So check that out. Now, as some of you may remember, last year I was actually sitting fireside across from Nahlah for the 2023 In Defense of Democracy event. So I am actually hugely relieved to be here tonight in a different capacity to pass the baton and introduce tonight's dynamic duo. Nahlah Ayed is the host of CBC Radio's IDEAS and a veteran of foreign reporting, first in the Middle East, where she spent nearly a decade covering the region's many conflicts. Later, Nahlah was based in London, covering so many of the major stories that really have shaped our current moment: Russia's annexation of Crimea, the Brexit vote and its fallout, and the worldwide refugee crisis. Nahlah's work has been recognized through numerous national and international awards and honorary degrees. She is also the best-selling author of The War We Won Apart. As of tonight, Nahlah is the four-time host of In Defense of Democracy, and we thank her for that. Joining her on stage, we have another spectacular award-winning journalist, of course, Connie Walker. A member of the Okanese First Nation in Saskatchewan, Connie has worked to expose the crisis of violence in Indigenous communities and the devastating impacts of intergenerational trauma stemming from Indian residential schools in Canada and the United States. She spent nearly 20 years as a reporter and host for the CBC, where she co-created and led the public broadcaster's Indigenous unit in 2013 and was part of a reporters who built a database of unsolved cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women in 2016. As a senior reporter in the investigative unit, Connie launched the multi-award-winning podcast Missing and Murdered, Under the true crime genre, the gripping series exposed the systemic issues at the root of the violence facing Indigenous women and girls. The winner of a Canadian Journalism Foundation Jackman Award and a Canadian Screen Award, she is also the recipient of the Awkward Fellowship from the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University and an honorary Doctor of Civil Law by the University of King's College. And there is more. The second season of her podcast, Stolen, Surviving St. Michael's, which I say is the kind of podcast where you pull into your parking spot and you don't get out of your car if the episode isn't done. It's so riveting. You can't stop listening. That season won a Peabody and a Pulitzer Prize. It premiered in 2022 and is one of the most comprehensive investigations into a single residential school. Its third season was released just earlier this year. So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people for 2024, Connie Walker, and IDEAS host Nahlah Ayed for this year's In Defense of Democracy.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Lisa. I'm like embarrassed a little bit.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you, Sabreena. Thank you, Connie, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Nahlah.
Thank you all for being here as well tonight. What a special and what a privilege for me to be here at this end of this conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I don't want to minimize the Pulitzer or the Peabody or the DuPont Award, but to be named as one of the 100 most influential people by Time Magazine, what did that feel like?
That was amazing, actually. The recognition was incredible, but the night of the gala was also really fun because I took my kid, who's 12 years old, and we sat at the table with Michael J. Fox, Uma Thurman, Kylie Minogue, and it was really it was such a surreal night, and their favorite, Dua Lipa, was performing, so it was very, very.
Oh my God! How did you pull her away?
I know, it was great. It was such a dream come true. Honestly, all of it feels so surreal. It really still does. Yeah. All this time later.
What kind of response did your family, friends, back here in Canada?
Yeah, I feel like for my family has always been my biggest support, and I think that they're always so excited for me because the podcast was being recognized in that way, and it's a personal podcast. It's a story about my father and his experience at a residential school. I think that, it's so much more meaningful to know that my family is part of that they, shared their stories, that we together collectively helped people understand how our family has been impacted by this history. And it very much felt like we were sharing in the accolades and the awards and the recognition as well.
Well, I hope you feel the hometown pride. I mean, you can even hear it here tonight.
Yeah, it's so nice.
So many fans of Connie Walker.
Oh, thank you.
We've, in prelude to my first real question, let me just say this, that we've often heard the phrase truth and reconciliation. What we haven't necessarily heard about as often is the relationship between truth and reconciliation. How reconciliation requires truth and how a healthy democracy cannot function without truth, without facts, and without reliable information. And I'm hoping that our conversation, is going to be a journey with you through your career, how you became Connie Walker, who's sitting here right now, and kind of this journey of becoming an investigative journalist to uncover the truth or truths, however disquieting they may be. So I want to go back to the beginning. And to echo something that Lisa said, I want to pause here and mention that we will be playing some audio clips from Connie's work. And of course, some of this concerns sensitive topics like violence against women and abuse. And so, again, to just flag that for you and to please take care. So going back to your high school years and to 1995 and to the story of Pamela George. She was 28. She was a mother of two. And she had been found beaten to death on the outskirts of Regina, Saskatchewan. Now, the police arrest some suspects, which, about whom you will hear in a moment in the clip. But before we play the clip, could you set the context? Could you talk about, before the trial happened, how much attention did this case of Pamela actually garner among the media?
To be honest, I wasn't a teenager who paid much attention to the news, honestly. I grew up and I watched Murphy Brown and E&G and those kinds of shows. Those were kind of like my introductions to journalism, but I didn't really think about that as a career until Pamela George. And I didn't know Pamela, as you said, she's a Saulteaux woman, and she was from a nearby reserve, just across the valley. I visited her community. We went to Powys there when I was a little kid with my grandma. But I think that the reason it resonated so much was because of how the trial was covered and because of the way that Pamela was spoken about in the media. And even though I wasn't somebody who paid attention to the news, I think every First Nations person in the province was paying attention because of that, because of what media was saying about Pamela and what they said about her life and how we all felt it when we heard it.
When you heard it. So let's hear it ourselves. If you don't mind, please play the first clip for us, the news report about Pamela George.
The accused are young and clean-cut. Steve Comerfield, a basketball star. Alex Ternowetsky, a hockey standout. They come from middle-class families. The victim was Aboriginal and a prostitute. The two men admit they were cruising Regina's streets one night last year looking for a hooker. In this area known for prostitutes, they admitted picking up Pamela George, taking her to a remote roadside, beating her, and leaving her behind. Her body was found the next morning by police. In court, a friend of the accused testified that Comerfield told him, "We drove around, got drunk, and killed this chick." And that Ternowetsky told him she deserved it. She was Indian. The accused denied making those comments. They also testified they didn't hit Pamela George that hard, that she was alive the night they left her behind. The defense has suggested that a third person may have come along and inflicted the beating that actually killed her. In his charge to the jury today, Judge Ted Malone called that scenario highly unlikely. But Malone also told the jury a first-degree murder conviction may not be appropriate. He reviewed evidence that the young men were drunk and may not have fully appreciated what they were doing that night.
And certainly not something that they're proud of, but it was something that went on with two 18-year-old guys who've got a serious alcohol problem and did at that time.
Oh, great spirit.
But at an Aboriginal prayer service outside the courthouse, attended by the victim's mother, one woman said the case is about more than two drunks being charged with murder.
It's more of a case of they think that just because a Native woman is walking on the street, they can go and take advantage of her and then go and kill her.
The RCMP beefed up security around the jurors and the courthouse today. They say it's just a precaution in a high-profile case. Eric Sorensen, CBC News, Regina.
So when you saw that report, as you mentioned, you were a teenager. What went through you?
I mean, I think that I don't want to single out the CBC. I feel like that's an example, but really there were also newspaper headlines that called Pamela, a prostitute, but didn't say much else about her life. And you can even hear in that report, there was so much attention paid to the fact that these were two university students, just
clean cut,
the basketball star, the hockey standout. And I remember, I think that I remember how I felt more than I could kind of process it really in the moment.
What was that feeling?
I mean, I was so hurt. I was so angry. I was so upset. And I think looking back, it's because I knew that if they could say that about Pamela, they would say that about me, or they would say that about my aunties or my cousins. And that was, that was such an, I think it was growing up in Saskatchewan, growing up in small town Saskatchewan, I grew up on my reserve and we were bussed into town. But, racism and discrimination is just part of life there. But it also was part of something that you knew that was, upsetting and hurtful. And I remember, my grandma used to always say, don't let anybody say that they're better than you. But, when you hear those taunts on the playground, they hurt, they're upsetting. Yeah. And this was such a clear, egregious example that it felt like it was too big to ignore and too painful to ignore. And there have been, like, that was, the first one that I remember, and there have been others since then. But it was the first time I thought about, who gets to tell our stories? Like, are there any Native people in newsrooms covering this trial? And that's when I thought about becoming a journalist.
So tell me about that. You said you felt anger and hurt. How did you channel those feelings?
I wrote something for our high school newsletter. We didn't have a newspaper. We're a very small school. Like, I went to the same school, K to 12, and I graduated with 28, or I was one of 28 kids in my class. So we had a very small school, but we had a newsletter. And I wrote something for the newsletter. Thankfully, there are no archives, honestly, because
Do you remember what you said?
I mean, I think it was more of an editorial than
Yes.
than a news story necessarily. And I think, I was really just so idealistic and wanting to, call out what I saw as like this grave injustice. And it's like, it felt like that, right? And I think collectively we all hear that and we can all feel it now. But back then, it was a different time.
Yeah, that was the norm.
It was the norm, yeah.
So there was a trial, and the men were convicted of manslaughter in the end and sentenced to 6.5 years each. You wrote that article, your first sort of act of journalism in the school paper. I'm just curious where you ended up filing that case in your mind.
Yeah, it stayed with me, honestly, and it still stays with me because, I think it was really the first case of a victim of violence, Indigenous woman, a victim of violence that I was interested in. But then obviously I've gone on to do so much more reporting. But so much of it has been really about, I think, honestly, like trying to make sense of my own experiences as a First Nations woman, like the similarities between the cases I've covered and my own lived experiences have been the kind of guiding through line in a lot of that reporting. And I still think a lot about Pamela George. I spoke at the University of Regina a couple of years ago, and one of her relatives was in the audience and came up afterward. And I think that it's such a great, like, terrible example of why it's so important that the media, has better representation, has Indigenous people to help tell these stories. And it's such a terrible example of the harm that it can cause when we mess up.
Yeah. So you did go on and you did, live up to that ambition and that desire that you had to help tell the story yourself.
Just like Murphy Brown.
Right. And you got yourself to the National, to that very show that you had criticized or had been concerned about the coverage of. So we're talking sort of circa 2014 approximately?
Yeah, I can't remember, yeah.
So I back then, I wonder if you could talk about that many years later after Pamela. How would you characterize the coverage of Indigenous stories at that time?
Well, in 2014, I feel like it was kind of just the beginning of what we've seen now 10 years later is, or at least what I kind of quantify now is like a huge transformation. And I feel like 2014 was kind of the beginning of that wave that was really, I think, caused by the shift to digital. And obviously we can all look back now and see how the shift to digital has changed all of our lives. But back then, it was in particular, I think, even more transformative for Indigenous communities because, so many people in our communities, like my mom never even had dial-up. Like, we didn't have internet on the reserve back then. And then people were being able to access it through their phones. And so I think Indigenous people across the country really kind of adopted it in this really profound way that it was just starting to change. And although I had, gotten into journalism to try to focus on these stories, it was, I think maybe I had filed 2 stories that were about Indigenous people until 2013,
Incredible.
2012. Yeah.
So, but tell us about that. I'm just curious what it was like for you when you pitched those stories, to editors, to others. Just what kind of reaction would you get?
Oh, I mean, it was not great, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, my first experience in the newsroom, and I joined the newsroom like in 2000. I was an intern at CBC in Halifax. And that was around the same time that Comerfield and Ternowetsky were released on parole. Like they were sentenced to 6 years, but ended up serving 4.5 years. And I was actually on the East Coast and a chase producer for the morning show. And like, just to give you an example of kind of the attitudes that I immediately encountered was I had booked the chief of a local reserve to come on the show to talk about the fisheries dispute that was happening. And my senior producer was like, did you tell him what time it was? Does he know exactly where to go? Because it was a morning show. It was a really early morning. And this was a Friday. And he was coming on the show on Monday. And I said, yes, he knows. And she said, because you know those Indians, they'll go out drinking all weekend and they won't show up on a Monday morning. And that was something that was, again, I was like, I just remember looking around. Like, I just remember freezing, actually, just being like, you have that fight or flight response. And I'm definitely a freeze person in those moments. But I did look around to see if anyone paid attention. And those moments were like not constant in my journalism career, but I think left enough of a mark on me. And so, I pitched other stories and had other disappointing encounters. But then, I think it just started to kind of gel and change a little bit.
And you persevered. I mean, you stuck around. And in 2015...
I really needed a job, honestly. I was like, this isn't my job.
But it must have been a hard thing to do, hearing that kind of language and not having the response you want. But that really began to change in 2015 when you became involved. Well, it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you actually were covering the TRC. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what it felt like to be doing that and how that changed attitudes among your colleagues and the people making the decisions.
Yeah, by 2015, it was really such a radical transformation because I remember I filed a story the year before for the National, and there was a feeling then that we couldn't have more than 2 Indigenous stories in one night. Like, it was just, that was a bit too much. But I remember I was in Ottawa in 2015 covering the final TRC event, and that led the National for 5 nights in a row, which at the time was honestly like, I still have goosebumps thinking about it, especially because on the night that the final report was released, the whole first 15 minutes of the show was all TRC coverage. Yeah. And that happened so quickly. And I feel like it was, there's lots of things that led to that. But the TRC and the work of the TRC, I think, was so important and integral to that transformation. And it was, for me, like one of the, the biggest moments in my career, absolutely, like filing for the lead story for the National, because it was the biggest story in the country that day, not just for CBC, but every network. But I remember it was also really hard. Like, it was such a difficult day because they played testimony of survivors at the event, and I remember late Justice Murray Sinclair saying to everyone that there's not a single Indigenous person in Canada who has not been touched by the legacy of residential schools. And he knew that was true because of the work he had just finished, 6 years of traveling the country, hearing from over 6,000 survivors, this incredible testimony. And I believed him when he said it, because of my own lived experiences. All 4 of my grandparents were residential school survivors. My father is a residential school survivor. But I also, so I remember thinking about my grandparents in particular that day because I knew the most about their experiences, even though I knew very, very, very little about their experiences. And I thought about, he's, again, talking about me and my family as well. And it was really, and it was hard. It was like, I want to be doing this. I want to be the person who helps to tell this story and helps to amplify the voices of survivors. And I still remember Vivian Ketchum was a survivor I interviewed that day, and she said she didn't want her story to become like a souvenir, like something that people are excited about today, but then that gets put on a shelf and it gets forgotten about and collects dust. And she didn't want that to be. And I remember feeling like that's like a responsibility that she's handing to me, that's like, this is not the end. This has to be the beginning of something.
Did it motivate you hearing that from
absolutely.
Like her? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was all so motivating. It was all like the recognition of how important it was, the fact that it was being acknowledged, not just within Indigenous communities, but by Canada and by journalists and my colleagues was so important. And absolutely an inspiration to keep going, because the TRC linked, because the next thing we focused on was the crisis of violence in Indigenous communities, specifically missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And it was because, of the TRC and the work that they did linking those two things.
I think I would venture to say that a lot of people in this audience, and I certainly do, remember your reporting during that time. And that really kind of, in my mind, I remember Connie Walker. And I think there was, as I say, a lot of pride and interest in what you were doing. The question that I have is, your storytelling is taking flight. You're inhabiting that role that you had sort of envisioned for yourself. Did you also at that moment have a sense that people were apprehending that the relationship between the truth and reconciliation and that it wasn't just important for the Indigenous communities, but it was also important for shoring up our very democracy?
Yeah, I think that it was like it was dawning on me. Like, I think that I always felt like, especially because most of my career was at the CBC, that, it was part of our mandate as a public broadcaster to better represent the communities we cover, which is obviously like there's so many shared values between, I think, in trusting the work we do as journalists and in helping to strengthen democracy, absolutely. But it also felt like at a certain point, like it was starting to change, that it was like we were now being able to prove that this was something that was important, not just because we're the CBC, but this is something important to Canadians. I think, again, the shift to digital when we launched, it's called CBC Indigenous now, but when we launched, it was CBC Aboriginal. And, we pitched that in, I think it was 2012, and we launched it in 2013. And when we launched, I was the only reporter that was dedicated to the unit, and we had a producer, but we were also able to work with Indigenous reporters across the country, one day a month or something. But there was we were getting very good traction with our stories, and we could actually say, this is how many times this story has been read, this is how many times it's been shared on social media. And in terms of the metrics, which were all, I'm sure you remember, so important back behind the scenes at the CBC, it was we could actually, there was traction. And I feel like then it was like proof. It was like, we don't have to rely on our own judgment about what Canadians think about, what Canadians are caring about. We actually can rely on these facts. We can actually point to this. And I feel like that was such a, I always wanted to believe it, but it was also like, hey, this is really happening. It was very exciting.
Yeah. Just making a turn to the next kind of important moment in your career. Your podcast series, Missing and Murdered, was in 2016, just 1 year after your turning point at the National with the TRC. You had worked in print previously. You'd worked on television, which is where many of us met you. At what point did you realize that actually radio storytelling and podcasting was the right medium to tell the kinds of stories that you wanted to tell?
Well, I remember, I'm sure, every podcaster who has been working in podcasting for the last few years probably was inspired by Serial. Season 1 of Serial. I remember also my husband, my boyfriend then, but my husband now, we sat in the living room across from each other on our couches and listened on a speaker. It was and we just sat there and you're just listening. We were so excited about it. And I remember as a journalist, feeling like it was so transformative, because it felt like so much of the work that you do is behind the scenes, and then eventually you work for days or weeks or months, and you then come on and you say, CBC News has learned X, Y, and Z. And this was a chance to kind of peel back the curtain. And that was the thing that initially honestly grabbed me, because we had at that point started reporting on some of the unsolved cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And in the first story that Marnie Luke, my producer at CBC, and I took on was the unsolved murder of a 15-year-old girl named Leah Anderson, who was killed in her community in northern Manitoba, God's Lake Narrows. And I remember Marnie and I traveled up to the community, and we were there for about a week, and we were focused on trying to get to know Leah through her friends and family, but also kind of uncover what happened to her as much as we could and retrace her steps that weekend. And I remember we were just hearing from so many people, because this was prior to that, the only article about Leah's death was another CBC story, but that didn't have a photo, that had a photo of her community in it and was just a couple hundred words. And so I think people wanted to, obviously in her community, wanted to have her story, have this murder be solved. Like, I think it was a very small community. And so we were so focused on the mystery element. And I remember thinking, like, this should be a podcast. This could be a podcast. But to be honest, it wasn't until a long time after that I realized that, oh, wait, this is actually the most, like, the best way to tell stories about First Nations or Indigenous communities.
So why? Tell me why.
Well, because it was following the death of Colton Boushie. I think you all remember that. Like, again, it was, it really reminded me of Pamela George and the way that, that Colton's death was covered in Saskatchewan was just such a raw and very difficult and sensitive time for First Nations. Like, I remember it just kind of heightened all of the racial tensions that obviously were still really prevalent in Saskatchewan, and even though I wasn't living at home, I go back home a lot, and I'm so close to my family, and so I felt like this was such a visceral thing. But some of our colleagues in Saskatchewan, Betty Ann Adam and Mervyn Brass and Jason Warwick, had organized a conference for journalists to try to help journalists from across the province come together to try to do a better job of telling these stories. And one of the keynote speakers that day was one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Marie Wilson, who's also a former journalist. And she gave her keynote at lunchtime, and I remember I was sitting like front row center, and I was so eager. And I felt like she was talking directly to me as well. And she used her keynote. I mean, she imparted so much wisdom about her work, for sure. But I felt like she used her keynote to kind of give us all heck and say, you guys aren't doing a good enough job. Like, this is your job as Canadians. And something she said that day really stuck with me.
And we're going to hear that. Yeah. We're going to hear that exact clip that you're talking about. But before we play it, I was wondering if you could just set the context. What do we need to know about just that day and what was going on?
Well, I mean, at that point, I was writing the first season of the podcast Missing and Murdered. And I was, again, I felt like so focused on the unsolved murder of Alberta Williams, who was the Indigenous woman who was killed, whose case we were covering. And I, we had done a lot of reporting, and there was a lot of pressure and deadlines and all the rest. And then I heard this clip from Marie, and it really changed the trajectory of our podcast, but honestly, all of my reporting.
Okay. So if we can hear the clip, that would be great. Thank you.
Don't skip the context. And that is the hugest trap, I know, for all working journalists when time is of the essence and there just isn't enough. And if you can't explain it in this story, explain it in the follow-up. Explain it. When did this story actually begin? And I think you are in the most privileged profession of all for that ability to start connecting the dots for us as Canadians. How did these things fit together? Because you do have time. My eldest daughter, when she was little, one time said to her friend to the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she said, I want to be a journalist like my mom. And she said, how come? And she said, because you get to sit around and watch TV all day and read papers. But it is a luxury, a privileged amount of time, however strained it may seem. And so help connect those dots. When did this story actually begin? So, for example, did the TRC begin with the opening or the closing of the schools? The apology that was spoken, it was the news of the day. But what did we know, or what were we told about the beginning of that publicly told story? Well, I've made my point on that, and I don't want to go on for the sake of time with other examples of that. But I would just say, and I hope this doesn't sound corny, I hope it sounds like it speaks to your calling to this profession, to listen patiently. It's the most important part of our job, is listening, and listening with our hearts. It's not about thinking. These were children, after all.
Yeah, it was really the question about when did this story actually begin? Because I think up until that point, I was again so focused on what happened the weekend Alberta was killed, and who was she last seen with, and where did they go, and who were the other witnesses that had never spoken to police. And that question made me, I thought about Alberta Williams. She was, a young woman when she was killed in 1989. But when did her story actually begin? Like, it wasn't with her murder. And then I thought in some ways, it wasn't even with her birth, that she was connected to this bigger story that we were, trying to shed light on and connect the dots. Like, how is MMIW connected, as the TRC said, to residential schools? And it changed the way we wrote that episode 4. Then, we included actually some of the testimony from the final event in 2015 that they played for us, and really tried to connect the dots in Alberta's life to that history. And also connect the dots, because Alberta's story actually came about because we received a tip from the former RCMP officer who was the lead investigator in her unsolved murder. And, we used that podcast to also try to explain the history between Indigenous communities and the RCMP, and why people didn't feel comfortable talking to him when he was investigating Alberta's case, and why, when we came 27 years later, they talked to us about things that had happened that weekend that they had never told this police officer. And so it was like a light bulb moment for me that this is actually, okay, this is meaningful. And also with a podcast, you have the space to do it.
Yeah. So context is everything, really,
Yeah.
is what you got from that. I also wondered that one phrase where she says, this is not about thinking. How did you understand that? What was she saying?
I mean, I think that it was really, her whole keynote was honestly like a lesson in the power of storytelling, right? As so many good speakers know how to do. And I think that for me, it was also the thing that engaged me in Serial, honestly, was like the story, the way they were telling the story and the story that they were telling. And with podcasting, it just felt like, okay, we can do that too. And I don't know, maybe that's very basic and everybody knows that, but it felt like such a kind of new idea for me at the time, and I really I think what we saw was how that resonated with people and how much they appreciated it. And one of the things that really stands out to me from that, when you're talking about all of these challenges in democracy, and the same ones that we're having in journalism around engagement and people existing in these silos or just wanting to believe the things that they already believe and be validated in that. But I remember hearing from people who said that although they thought they knew about residential schools, or they worked with Indigenous communities either as healthcare workers or social workers, but after listening to the podcast, they came away with a different understanding. And that was true for me as well. As the journalist who was doing the reporting and writing the podcast, I came away this was an education for me too.
Yeah, for all of us, I think. I think in a way, you kind of repeated throughout your work, repeatedly reminding us of that context, at least in my mind, sort of conjures up this image of you holding up a mirror to us and having us kind of look back at ourselves. I wonder what it is that you wanted most for us to see in that mirror.
I mean, I think it's, again, it's to see the humanity of Indigenous people, which again should be the bare minimum and should be the most basic thing that you can see. But if you think back to the Pamela George or Colton Boushie or other stories that have really kind of proved, unfortunately, again and again, how there's so many stereotypes that exist about Indigenous people, about First Nations people in this country, that you're it's so hard to get past that. And I was speaking actually with being interviewed by a different journalist recently, and she was responding in ways that I immediately knew she wasn't from Canada. She didn't have that experience. She didn't grow up here. She was from somewhere else. But I think that there's so much of what we have grown up with and what we have just kind of absorbed in Canada, that of course, that those attitudes that exist in Canadian society exist in Canadian journalism. Like we can see that truth, we know and can understand that. And I think it was really about trying to create space for empathy and create space for people to hear about Pamela George and the way that we hear about her now, and have empathy for a young single mom who was struggling to raise her family, and that is something that I think is definitely my goal.
Yeah. It's kind of a difficult time for storytellers, I would say. I think everybody here would agree, many people would agree, that there's no shared truth anymore the way we knew it maybe 20, 30 years ago. I wonder if you could talk about the importance of the work you do in trying, the Samara Center does research on, the state of democracy. Their latest research was about the Toronto mayoral election. But it feels like every year we've done this, some of the same results come up over and over again. There's abuse of the candidates, online. There's, contested basic truths. I wonder where you see your role as a storyteller and an investigative journalist in trying to counteract some of those things that are chipping away again at our democracy.
Yeah, it's so hard, I think. And I feel like one of the things, or what I'm kind of led by are things that I respond to in storytelling, like as an audience member. Again, with documentaries or with films, and the thing that I think I've tried to kind of mirror again is the transparency that we can have in journalism, and how that is a way to acknowledge how my lived experiences as an Indigenous woman absolutely affect every part of my life, but also every part of my work. I'm informed by that. And this idea of, or this myth, as some people say, of objectivity in journalism and just being transparent about that, I feel like is a way of kind of peeling back that curtain and hopefully addressing some of the mistrust that exists. I feel like, there's so many shared challenges in this industry of journalism, but also in this quest for true democracy and engagement and trust, and I think that's something that I feel like has been something I always appreciate when I'm listening to a story or watching a story, is transparency and honesty, and being able to acknowledge that. And that's something that has felt like, honestly, a big tool for me. Yeah.
So for the last part of this, I wanted to talk about your latest project and your, Surviving St. Michael.
Yeah.
And I want to start that by asking you about your family. You come from a very large family.
Very large. Very, very large.
13 siblings?
Yeah. I mean, I always have to count them because, but yeah.
And your mom and dad had also a large.
On both sides. Like my mom, again, I would have to count them. I should know this, but over a dozen siblings, and my dad was one of 16 or 17 kids in his family, and so very big families, very, very big families.
So given that complicated, I guess, that large complicated family, I'm curious just how aware you were as you were growing up of the context, as we talked about.
Yeah, not aware at all, honestly.
Residential schools.
No. I mean, I think I'm sure I'd heard of residential schools for sure, but no, not at all aware. In fact, so my mom was a young mom. She was 17 when I was born and still at home with my grandparents. So I was very close to my grandparents, and they helped raise me. And in particular, my grandpa and I spent a lot of time together, in the car. He would pick me up after ball practice, and then when I got old enough to drive, I would drive him around to garage sales, and we just spent so much time in the car together. But it wasn't until I was in university and I was taking an oral history class, or Indian studies class focused on oral history, and one of my assignments was to interview somebody to record their oral history. So I went home and interviewed him, and it was through this interview that I learned that he was sent to residential school when he was 6 years old. And I was so shocked by that. I had no idea. And he didn't, I could tell he didn't want to talk too much about his experience, but he did share some things with me. And I just remember just that it was, I was in my 20s after spending so much time with him, before. And my grandmother, like, I never spoke to her about her experience at residential school. I only heard about it from my mom after my grandmother passed away, that she ran away from the residential school. We're in Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. And she was sent to Manitoba, to residential school, Birtle, Manitoba. And she and a friend ran away and walked home, like, over days, and they made it home. And whatever happened to her there that made her want to run away, it also made her adamant that her kids wouldn't go. So my mom and her brothers and sisters didn't go to and I didn't go to residential school.
But again, you learned all that later.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's curious. Your award-winning series, Surviving St. Michael's, does delve into your family history and specifically your father's experience at residential school. And you've said out loud, even this week in some of your media interviews, that you've been reluctant to kind of feature yourself and your family history in your reporting. I'm wondering when it is that you realize, and you talked about this a bit earlier, that this was not an impediment to your journalism, but actually something that could inform it as a really important tool to help explain and elucidate the story of residential schools.
I think it was like gradual for sure. Like, but I feel like, especially in the first 10 years of my career, like, I was really wary of being the Aboriginal reporter. Yeah. And I think that especially at that time, like, there was a feeling that you would be seen as more of an advocate than a journalist, and that, that you would be biased. And so I think it was like dipping my toe in here and there. And then it was the podcasting, and it was the ability that like as the host of an 8-part series, like an investigation, like, you're kind of bringing people along with you as you like knock on someone's door, and your inclusion in this story is different than the way that I up until that point had been telling stories.
How was that?
I actually love that. Yeah. I love that part of it.
It's very good. It's very effective.
Yeah. I mean, but I also just like that feeling of like, we're just kind of opening it up, and here it is. And maybe sometimes a bit too transparent about some of the things we were doing and the mistakes we were making.
But the parts of you in the library, looking through archives and going, oh my God, incredibly, you do bring us along. Very effective.
And the archives, like, I mean, some of the most exciting places you could ever visit. Like, wow, it was like, I remember the second day we only had a limited amount of time there for Surviving St. Michael's, and I remember I requested so many boxes, and I was like there, and I was there by myself that time. And I was like trying to get through as much as I could. And I left the library, and I was like all sweaty and disheveled. And I was like, this is so exciting.
But what do you do? Do you bring a microphone with you? Or
yeah. And I mean, you just kind of get used to doing this, like recording conversations with yourself as though you're talking to somebody else. And sometimes I will, like in Surviving St. Michael's, I actually, because it was such a personal story, and I was doing the interviews like in my dad's community of Beardies and Okamasis, but I often would drive back to Saskatoon because my family was with me sometimes, and we were staying in the city. And on those phone calls, I would call my husband Chuck, and I would just kind of debrief like what had just happened and what we had just learned, and some of those like were recorded and made it into the podcast too.
Incredibly difficult terrain to navigate, not just on the emotional level, talking to some of your family, about things you've never talked to them about, but also the actual, getting the information.
Yeah.
Just what kind of hurdles did this process throw up in your work?
Well, I think initially, the goal was to try to learn. I had learned after, in May of 2021, I had learned that my dad was abused by a priest at the residential school. And, it made me want to know more about, like, it answered so many questions that I had about him because I didn't know really anything about his residential school experience, but it also brought up so many more questions. And so initially, I just wanted to better understand how that experience shaped him and how it shaped the dad he was to me and how that impacted my childhood. And then once we started interviewing other family members, because my father passed away in 2013, so I couldn't interview him or talk to him about it, but I was interviewing his brothers and sisters who were with him at the school and hearing about like other abuse that they had experienced. And then it kind of broadened out and became bigger, and we wanted to try to get a sense of actually like what was the scale of abuse at this one school. And then we started wanting to talk to as many survivors as we could and interview as many survivors from this one single residential school. And at the archives, you know, I learned that that school was open for over 100 years and that 4 generations of my family went to this school. Like starting with like my great grandfather, my chapan, in 1903 or something like that. It was open since the late 1800s. But it was the first time my family had had any of this information. And it just made me want to know as much as I could about this school, especially because from the survivors, we were hearing about widespread abuse and widespread sexual abuse and physical abuse. And, you know, I think that one of the things that was so enlightening about it was that, you know, as a journalist, I had been reported a bit on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also the final event, but also the IAP process, which is a process that was part of the residential school settlement where survivors, 26,000 survivors participated in the IAP and testified in detail about abuse they experienced at residential schools.
What's the IAP?
It's called the Independent Assessment Process, and it was part of the residential school settlement. Like survivors experienced like a common experience payment, like a $10,000, and then I can't remember if it was a couple thousand for each year attended, but if they experienced abuse, they could go through the IAP process for additional compensation. So 26,000 survivors did do this and, you know, testified in very, you know, graphic detail about abuse they experienced at residential school. But all of that information has never been made public in terms of like understanding the scale of abuse at individual schools or how many people, priests and nuns and staff members, people who were charged with looking after the schools were accused of abuse through this process. That information was essentially what we were seeking for surviving St. Michael's for this one school. But all of that information has, you know, to protect the privacy of survivors, has been kept private. Mm-hmm. And it's actually all of those records are going to be destroyed in less than 3 years, in September 19th, 2027. And so we couldn't access those IAP documents to learn about this one school. So we had to try to find another way to get that information.
And what was that other way?
Well, one of our producers, Chantal Belrichard, had an idea, because what led to the residential school settlement was the fact that, you know, in the 90s and 2000s, thousands of survivors started coming forward and suing the federal government and the churches for the abuse they experienced in residential schools. And eventually it became one of, you know, what was then the largest class action lawsuit in the country. And so thousands of survivors sued the government about residential school abuse. So we thought if we could ATIP those lawsuits, we could get a sense of what happened at this one school. And so we ATIPed file numbers for survivors of St. Michael's. And then we traveled to courthouses, which are also very exciting places to visit, in Regina and Saskatoon.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. And then we were able to access 500 lawsuits from this one school.
Okay. What surprised you the most in what you uncovered in that?
Honestly, it's so heartbreaking. Like, I think that maybe naively I had an idea with like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the incredible work that they did, and not just the work of collecting testimony of survivors, but then the work of putting it all together through the calls to action, and then through all of the volumes that had survivor testimony throughout. That, you know, there was such a thorough, you know, sense of what was happening at residential schools and what survivors endured. But I think that, you know, what this process made me realize is how much truth there is still yet to uncover about residential schools and about individual residential schools. So in those lawsuits, there were over 220 allegations of sexual abuse against kids by 17 priests and 13 nuns at this one school and 15 staff members, including some of my relatives. We saw some of their lawsuits. And I think that then, being able to, because I was the daughter of a survivor and the niece of other survivors, like I could see and connect through how that rippled through my father's life, and then through my life, and then through so many other people in our family and community.
And just a tip of the iceberg, one school.
Yeah, of the 130 schools across the country. And yeah.
Well, I thought we'd play maybe a clip from the podcast, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Just what do we need to know about this particular clip?
Well, when we decided to broaden the scope of our investigation and try to talk to as many survivors as we could from this one school, one of the survivors we spoke to was Eugene Arcan, who knew my dad and was at the school with him, but also, knew him throughout his life. And he really he also worked a lot with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he really, it was such an incredible interview, but really cautioned me about the responsibility of telling these stories, and told me what an elder had told him when he started working with other survivors. And he said, don't play with this, this is a big responsibility. And again, it impacted the way that we did the podcast, and we wanted to create a space to hand the mic over for survivors to tell their own stories in their own words. And really what it ended up being was a whole episode really where you just hear their voices, but also myself and Betty Ann Adam, who also did a lot of the interviews with survivors, kind of reconstructing the school through their voices and memories.
Okay. If you could play the clip, please. Thank you.
I know what happened. I lived it. What happened? I lived it. For all the years, my growing up years that were taken away from me, brutally, when I should have had those memories.
When I think of it, it's sad memories. When I think of it.
Has there been anything that has helped you to heal?
My sweat lodge.
Sometimes we cry for each other. We don't sit there and share tears because we're crying for ourselves. It's for each other. Like, who has been held accountable for the things that they have done to us? Nobody.
Is there any way for justice?
No, the only justice I got out of that was the way I treated my kids. And I never hit my kids, never. I hugged and kissed my kids and told them I loved them. And we raised them right. That's the only injustice I got, was the way I loved my kids so much.
I just love that last clip of Frank Badger because I feel like that's what I felt. Honestly, like in spite of the fact that there was this painful history that my family endured, that we were shown so much love, like my grandparents and my parents and my aunts and uncles, like we have such a close-knit family, and they showed us so much love, and they taught us the importance of family and community and responsibility, and I'm so grateful to them, especially now that I have a better sense of what they survived and what they endured, that they were able to persevere. And my dad, this process was about finding out more about him, and I didn't get all of the answers maybe, but I think I was able to see how he persevered and kept going and reclaimed the culture and language and spirituality that they tried to take from him. And I feel like through that process, I got to know him better as well. We're so grateful.
So given the trajectory of your career, here we are so many years later after Pamela and that article you wrote for the school paper. How would you describe the change between that time and this moment? You as a Pulitzer Prize winner, again, one of the top 100 influencers in 2024, how would you describe the change that's happened in this period?
I mean, for me, it feels like it's been like just a huge transformation. I'm like, I honestly still can't believe it. And I feel like, because it was a long time before it actually happened in my career, I feel like an urgency. Like I have to keep going. Like there's this space right now, but who knows what's going to happen in 3 years or 5 years. And now it feels like there is this acknowledgement. There's like so much change in terms of like the recognition of the importance and also the recognition of supporting Indigenous people to help tell our own stories. But I also feel like there's so much out there. Like how could it be 2022 when our podcast came out that we're just learning the truth about this one school? Yeah. Like how can that be? Like I feel like there's so much more of that work to do. I would like to do what we did with Surviving St. Michael's on a broader scale. Like
how broad?
Well, I mean, every school. I think it should happen for every school, especially because of the IAP records and the destruction of those records. That's going to be happening in 3 years. Like that's like what is going to be lost with that information. Like that history, that truth about residential schools. Like I know now, as an intergenerational survivor, as a journalist, as a Canadian, as a mother, how important it is for us to protect as much of that truth as we possibly can, but also preserve it for future generations.
Yeah. I can feel and hear the urgency and understand the reasons why you say it is. Could you broaden that and explain briefly why this should be urgent for all of us?
I mean, one of the things that I was in Berlin a couple of years ago at a journalism conference, and I remember just walking around and just seeing everywhere all of the public displays of their history. Like every building that you pass has a little brass marker with the names and birth dates and where they, like, of the people, Jewish people who used to live there, who were killed in the Holocaust, and where they died and what happened to them. And then also all of the big public, displays as well. And just the juxtaposition of here in Canada. Like, we have this incredible work of the TRC, which is so important, but what else, what else do we have? Like, I feel like this is such an important history in Canada that we're just beginning to, at least I feel like so much of my career has really been about, my own journey to learn about myself and my own part of this history. I feel like it's so important for all of us.
Last thing, and I will have a few questions from the public that have been given to us, but I want to ask this one last question. As we said, we started talking about you as a high school student. We heard from Mary Wilson about how this is about children. The focus throughout your work has been about children, because that's who was the victim at those residential schools. And so now you're a mom. Mm-hmm. And you have a daughter. And I wonder, as a final note, if you could say what you would like reconciliation to look like for her as she grows up.
I mean, it's so emotional to think about that, honestly, because it is about, my child, but it's also about all of my nieces and nephews and all of, my cousins and their kids and all of our families and communities. Like we have all been shaped by this legacy and this history in really painful ways, but we've been able to have so much love and support in spite of that. And for them, I mean, I feel like this hopefully. It's what Lisa said earlier about how we're doing better than we have before, and I think about how brave my grandma was to run away from that school, but also to always tell us, like, don't ever let anybody say they're better than you. And she was the kind of person who, like, when we went to Eatontown and people would stare at us because we were Native, she would look back and say, boo. I'm like, so I feel like, and my mom was such a strong, incredible woman, and that I want to be a positive example for them, and so that they don't have the burden. And I know that I don't have it in the way that my mom had it, in the way that my grandmother had it as a survivor, but to hopefully make things better for them.
Well, you're such a positive example to all of us, an inspiring one, and one we're all very proud of. Thank you very much, Connie, for taking all my questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. That wasn't as bad as I was expecting. Oh my gosh. I was so nervous. Now I feel better now.
We do have questions from the public, which I mean, we're almost out of time, but I think we have time for a couple maybe, or three, right?
Okay, I'm nervous again.
I think it's a yes. Two. Okay, we have time for two. Okay, that's what I'm being told. So here's a question from Kitchener, Ontario. How do you navigate the challenges of telling stories that hold power to account, especially when facing resistance or obstacles from powerful institutions?
I mean, that's what actually gets me going. I like that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I really do. I feel like anger is such a big motivator for me. If somebody tells me no, then I'm like, what? I don't understand that. Does not compute. No, I really rely on the investigative element and the search for truth and justice and accountability, like to kind of get me through some of the more difficult parts of the job. I feel like that's the kind of propeller.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We can ask you some of these later, but this is number 5 here. This is from Grant, someone with the name of Grant in Toronto, Ontario. How might we draw on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practices for democratic renewal?
Wow. Okay, that's a really hard one. I mean, I feel like I'm not necessarily the person to answer that. I'm thinking about the late Justice Murray Sinclair and all of the teachings that we were so lucky to be blessed by that he gave us through not just his work as commissioner, but his work after the fact. And one of the things that I thought about recently was being able to hear him speak about how important it is to remember and how important it is to remember our history and acknowledge the truth of this country. But I feel like as a cultural leader, I feel like, there are so many people like him who I think have a lot to share. And it's been so, as devastating as it is, obviously, that we have lost him, it's been so incredible to see how well he is remembered and how, widely acknowledged his legacy of all of his work has been. So I would counsel people to look to those kinds of cultural leaders.
Okay, I'm told we have room for one more.
Oh no!
If you're game, are you game?
This
may be. Yeah, I think no problem here. It sometimes seems like the only role of citizens in a democracy is to vote, and then quote leave it up to the politicians. Can you talk about practical ways citizens can engage productively and continuously between elections?
Oh, wow. That is another hard one. I mean, I feel like I'm not a very prescriptive journalist in terms of like how people should or shouldn't engage. I feel like our role is to shine a spotlight and to help people know the truth and to help people have as much context as they can to understand these issues. And I feel like, that sometimes turns into engagement, hopefully. Like that's the goal, is that you take this information and you decide, hey, this is important to me. I think, reconciliation is important, or I want to do X, Y, or Z, and then are empowered to do that with the knowledge and information and work that we do. But I think that's also, part of what that means to be an active citizen, really, is I hope that this work is used. I feel like it's the biggest compliment that I get is when I hear that educators are using our podcast in their classrooms. Like that, to me, I think like if I quibble with Marie Wilson about one thing, I think educators are actually in the most privileged position to help connect the dots for children, because they are also primed to be learning, and they understand it in a different way. They don't have as many of the barriers that we had growing up.
Okay. That's all the time we have, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Connie.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie and Nahlah, for such an important and moving conversation. Your contributions to In Defense of Democracy tonight are so appreciated. I'm going to wrap us up by thanking our event sponsors once again: the Donner Foundation, Stikeman Elliott, Toronto Foundation, Nextdoor, Massey College, Catalyst, and Toronto Metropolitan University. Thanks to Ontario Heritage Trust for allowing us to be in this beautiful space, and thanks also to CBC Radio's IDEAS for their continued partnership. I also want to take a moment to recognize the Samara Centre's excellent team and our tremendous board of directors for helping to make tonight possible, in particular our chair, Michael McMillan. It is such a privilege to work on strengthening our democracy, and we can't do it without you. If you enjoyed tonight's program and want to support more of our work, please donate using the QR code on your program or at samaracenter.ca, and don't forget to check out that merch table. Thanks for sharing this evening with us. Good night.